Celeste Headlee, one of our favorites. Celeste is best, is what I briefly nicknamed this when I was saying that we're going live, because yesterday, Kim Nyborg, longtime listener, said, "You are one of her all-time favorites. Where have you been?" And I said, "I'll reach out to her right now." And so thank you for being available.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on again.
We love Celeste Headlee, and congratulations on the fact that you just told me you just turned in your new book about your grandmother 4 months earlier, and that's why you have time to talk to us. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. My great-grandmother, and this is the fourth book that I've written, and I wrote 2 shorter ebooks. All 6 of them turned in early. So I just, FYI, my publishers, my agent's always telling me that publishers love journalists because we take deadlines seriously. But yeah.
Yeah, you are an author and a journalist and so many other things, a speaker, a consultant, but specifically you definitely wear both those hats because you are a legitimate both a journalist and author. You've done it all in journalism, and you've done it all with your books, because your books are all about several different issues, which makes you such a great person to talk to. Certainly, I got to ask you, I'm going to ask you at some point during this conversation about We Need to Talk, your book, because Kim also texted me and said, oh, let me just read it to you. A friend of mine had just asked me about my top 3 book recommendations. We Need to Talk is always on that list. She stayed reading it this month and texted me just now to say how much she's loving it. How about that, Celeste?
That's pretty great. Yeah, I mean, that's what you want, right? You want your books to be useful to people.
How to have conversations that matter. That's always important, always relevant, and super helpful for people in their lives, right? Say a bit about that book.
Yeah, so I mean, that book came directly out of the TEDx talk I did in 2015 on 10 ways to have a better conversation. And it was basically my chance to dig into an issue that really only took me 11 minutes to talk about on the TEDx stage, right? But like all of my books, the receipts are there. I'm never going to give people suggestions that aren't based in evidence, in good scientific research, and things that I've tested myself. So, interestingly enough, I wrote in that book about the urgency of engaging in more empathetic and more productive conversations, and things have gone the other way. Things have gotten worse since then, which means it's yet more urgent than when I initially wrote that book. But it's used on a lot of college campuses, which I think is a good sign.
I was having problems with my mic, maybe. People told me live. Sorry about that. Does it work okay now?
You sound like a Dalek. You ever watch Doctor Who?
Now I do.
Exterminate. You sound a little bit robotic.
It still does.
Is that what people are complaining about? I can't hear you at all now.
How about now?
Now I can hear you.
But I don't sound as good because I'm on the computer mic. But it doesn't matter. You're going to be mostly talking, and I'm going to figure it out.
Yeah.
It says...
You sounded fine at the very, very beginning, and then you started sounding like a Dalek.
I wish you would stop calling me that name. It's hurtful. But it sounds like that's exactly what I sound like. So...
Yeah. Not anymore. Anyhow.
There's a bunch of things I wanted to talk with you about today, as always. Certainly wanted to get your framing on how you see what's happening in the world, starting with the issues around immigration, deportation. You've covered this issue forever as a journalist, from the politics of it to all the human rights, to the economics, the socioeconomics, the cultural issues, all of it. You know, the history of this country and so many others. How are you seeing this moment with these mass deportations and now all the funding apparently they need? Like, how do you compare it to history? How do you articulate what it is uniquely American?
I mean, I have to rely on the scholarship and the research of experts who've spent their careers studying authoritarianism and fascism, right? This is not my area of expertise. I can give you my expertise based on my personal encounters with oppression and fascism. I can give you my opinion, but when I really want to know, when I see comparisons, say, to today and Nazi Germany, I immediately go to the people who actually have studied Nazi Germany, who have studied the rise of Mussolini in Italy, who have studied the rise of dictators and fascists in Asia and in Africa, etc. And there's no getting away from the fact that that's what we're seeing, those exact same things in the United States. However you may feel about that personally, whatever your emotions might be about that, that's just the objective truth. Some of the things that every authoritarian does, trying to undermine confidence in systems that check power. That would be systems like universities, like courts, like medical experts and boards, things like that. Trying to loosen, centralize power within the executive branch. Trying to surround the executive with diehard loyalists. These are all things that you see in the rise of almost every authoritarian regime in world history. And that is what we are seeing now. I mean, I get why people say stop comparing Donald Trump to Hitler. I understand that. But, I saw a video on TikTok of this older gentleman saying, I went back and growing up, I used to watch those videos of Hitler speaking, and they were scary, and he was yelling, and, it just looked like absolute evil. He said, but AI is now able to translate those speeches. That's a little weird. He was just speaking in German. He didn't need AI to translate it. But he said AI is now able to translate these, and the things that he's saying are things I kind of disagree with, focusing on values, maintaining the standards of your nation, and all of these things. And he's like, and it starts to make me think, maybe the title of his video was, "Were we on the wrong side of history?" And that's what makes these comparisons important, because of course we were not on the wrong side of MFing history, right? And if you look at the end result of the Nazi policies and show them the piles of dead bodies and the tortured people and the just terrible, terrible condition that Jews and homosexuals and Romani people were in, mostly Jews, when they were liberated, there's no way to defend that. But that's why these comparisons are made. And as somebody who grew up in a Black and Jewish household with Jewish ancestors constantly saying to me, never forget, never forget, never forget. That's what they were telling us to never forget. It wasn't the specifics of their experiences in the concentration camps. It was that this is what humankind is capable of if you're not careful. So I don't dismiss these comparisons because, like I said, the experts say they're valid, but also because this is in recent memory that this happened, and it can happen again.
Really well said. I don't know if my audio is working. Do you hear me okay, Celeste, or no?
No, you sound like that thing I'm not supposed to call you.
Okay, I'm going to switch over. Oh, I'm at the wrong spot. Let me ask you one more bad audio question, and then I'll have it fixed while you're talking.
Okay.
How are you seeing what's happening in California specifically? When does this start to get worse or change for the better? How closely are you watching that? How do you watch it and not get destroyed every day?
I assume you're talking about the ICE raids and the use of deployment of not just ICE, but National Guards soldiers on the streets of Los Angeles, what we saw in MacArthur Park. And now Mayor Karen Bass said that there was actually a camp of young people, children, in MacArthur Park that they had to rush to get them away so they didn't have to see and be traumatized by watching interactions between ICE and regular American citizens. I'm a Californian. I was born in LA County. I grew up straddling 1 foot in Orange County, 1 foot in Los Angeles. And they've picked the wrong place. If this was the strategy, was to show that you know, California and especially Los Angeles and Hollywood are really typical punching bags for the right wing extremists and conservatives, um, because they like to show how weird they are, how outside they are of the normal. But much like New York, Californians are pretty um, protective of the things that they work so hard to build and their own community. And it's a large enough community that they can feel a sense of belonging among each other. Again, very much like New York. So they've chosen the wrong place for this. It would have been better to go somewhere else if this is what they were trying to do, that they could intimidate a population, that they can cow a population through a show of force. We've also seen videos of people in Los Angeles literally driving ICE agents back into the building where they were taking shelter. It's just is the wrong place. And that doesn't mean I'm not trying to diminish the suffering of Californians who are being dragged off and never heard from again. I would like to point out how quickly the idea that they were only going to deport criminals went straight out the window. I mean, that left the conversation almost as soon as the inauguration occurred, right? And not a single blink of the eyes. And now they're saying they're going to go after citizens. Like the fact that this is happening and that people are mostly, not outraged by this. I don't know how you feel about this, Pete, but the number of things completely outrageous, unacceptable, like this means war, all lowercase letters, type of incidents that are occurring that people are just like blithely moving on from.
Yeah.
I saw a post on Blue Sky from a guy who said, how upsetting it is that there has not been a mass exodus from Twitter after the anti-Semitic rant that Grok went on, right? And he felt that there was a betrayal, especially in this world in which people are using anti-Semitism as a justification for all kinds of fascist acts. And I feel that way about a lot of things. Like there are so many things that should have been the line in the sand, right? And we've just walked right over them. I mean, how do you feel about that? Like these things that, honestly, as a journalist, if you had told me some of these things that are happening, if 5 years ago you had said, oh, this is what's going to happen, I would have been like, that's ridiculous. Come on, don't be alarmist. But here we are.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
I feel that in general, most Americans continue to be apathetic and aren't necessarily engaged, that we are a country of very self-interested people. And while we're horrified to watch this, unless it's directly affecting our bottom line, our health, our current state of happiness, then people just they look at it and go, that's terrible, and I'll do whatever I can. And this is sad to see, but for me, I'm going on vacation. Life is pretty good. I still have my health insurance, my job, my kids are going to college. I often think about all these great quotes from civil rights leaders, particularly Dr. King, about silence, and those that all those specific quotes about, I can't think of them off the top of my head. But that's why I certainly am motivated starting there, but but that's what I think. People are self-interested until it affects them, then they don't necessarily get out in the streets or necessarily do things to change. What do you think of that self-interest argument?
I think
Comfort.
that's true. Now, I'm going to give most people a little bit of a caveat here, a little bit of comfort to take, which is that there's a few things going on. Number one, the American economy has been built literally from the beginning. The founding fathers built in a preference for wealthy people. It's baked into the Constitution. And a lot of people talk about how corporations suddenly became people, right? But actually, the Supreme Court has given corporations the same rights as people going back to just after Reconstruction, when they started saying that the 14th Amendment referred to corporations. So I just want to say that our society is built in a way that puts everybody into fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
Everyone is in crisis or on the edge of crisis all the time, right? Even if you're secure, it would not take too much disruption to make you very insecure. So that's number one. It is extremely difficult to stretch your compassion and stretch your empathy for other people when you yourself are in need of it. The other thing is that, they are flooding the zone. There are so many horrible things happening on so many different levels and in so many different areas. You start to become inured because that's what self-preservation looks like. And especially if you are somebody who feels deeply, the emotional tax that comes from, again, stretching your compassion out for every single person who's suffering can be debilitating. And there's a certain amount of self-preservation involved in compartmentalizing.
Yes.
Quite frankly, I feel like as a journalist, I'm really grateful for the training I got in compartmentalization. The training that allows me to report on disasters, to visit tragedies, yet still be able to go to dinner and, eat a baked potato or whatever. That's serving me well right now. So I just want to give people a little bit of a pass here. But what comes along with this is that our toleration of this situation. We should not tolerate a society in which over 90% of us are unable to be compassionate because we're constantly in crisis. That's not acceptable. And that's what we should be working on. We should see ourselves and we should look at ourselves and say, I cannot bring myself to read one more account of suffering. I cannot yet again go watch this video of ICE agents, pulling an old man to the ground, right? I forgive you for that, but I don't forgive you if the next step isn't how do I change the system so that I am actually able to show compassion for others.
Your voice and the way that you use it just here in this conversation is really wonderful, and I appreciate your passion and sensitivity and your wisdom based on your experience and understanding of history and your experience as a journalist. So just want to acknowledge that. But I now want to move on to asking you about the journalism of the day. You've seen it all, you've done it all: print, TV, radio, internet, all of it. And we're in this new world with all its caveats, the good and the bad. How do you know who's reliable, or what do you want to talk about in terms of that journalism or media trends are getting wrong? You're always good to talk about and reframe with language as well as kind of historical references that you're making here. And you're talking about how we shouldn't be buying into the government's propaganda around Alligator Alley and things like that. We should be referring to what it really is. So talk to me about media, journalism, criticism, and specifically how some things are being discussed. Anything you want to choose there?
Yeah, so, let's start first with why you have major news media referring to the legislation as big, beautiful bill, right? Now, the justification always is, well, that's what they called it. But if they had called it the N-word, you wouldn't use that word, regardless of what name they put on there, right? So it's possible for you to refer to something other than its official name when you realize that its official name is unacceptable. I think that repeating propaganda is unacceptable. And you and I have talked about this before. Like, I spent 2 years studying how journalists aid in the spread of propaganda and misinformation. And again, I hate to go on and on about experts, but there are people who devote their lives to studying this. One of the things I just posted this morning was that the beauty of science is that every scientific breakthrough began with someone admitting they were wrong.
Right, I saw that post. Yeah.
They don't know something, right? it begins with intellectual humility. And it's the same thing with misinformation and propaganda. Like, we haven't had this moment when especially our elite journalists are willing to admit they were wrong. We had this huge breakdown in journalistic confidence after the Iraq War because we were so effing wrong, right? But we didn't come away with a massive change because we were never able to admit it, right? We said we were lied to, we were manipulated, right? We wrongly trusted in the officials. Well, you shouldn't have anyway. You should always be, we should be the most skeptical people out there. And we're the ones who see the sausage being made, so we know every politician is full of crap, right? We haven't had that reckoning. And this is why you have credible journalists using the name Alligator Alcatraz. That is ridiculous. And the kind of callousness it shows towards human life is unacceptable. Call it the Dade County facility or whatever. Fine. Tie it to Florida. But don't give it this name that is intolerable and should not appear on any credible news organization's page or video or whatever. This also goes with the crap that the New York Times has been spilling about Mamdani, the New York City mayoral candidate. I don't live in New York. I'm not going to be voting. I got no dog in this race. But I will say that the things that they protected the private information of white supremacists when there was a hack and they were sent information about white supremacists, like Christopher Rufo. And they said, that's in interest of privacy. Even white supremacists deserve privacy. And yet they get hacked information about something that somebody filed, an application they filed when they were still a teenager, and they just, the next day, front page news. This double standard, it's unacceptable. And if you cannot justify what you're doing, if you are called to account and you cannot account for your reporting, then you need to retract it and admit a mistake. And that's what they're not capable of doing.
Where else are you seeing that the reporting that you think needs to be retracted, whether it be the Times or anywhere else? What do you think of Jake Tapper and his reporting about Joe Biden's health, this book he wrote? I mean, do you think that journalists missed the boat on that, should have done a better job at reporting Biden's health, and that, talking about it now is...
I mean, I went back when Jake Tapper's book came out, and I went back
Mhm.
to see if there had been a lot of reporting about Biden's health. And guess what? There was.
Yeah,
There was a lot of reporting about Biden's
there
health.
was. Yeah.
There was no missed story there. People didn't drop the ball. If you want to find reporting about Joe Biden's health or his age or references to his age, it's constant. Even when he was vice president, there were constant referrals to his age and his mess ups and his slip ups. I've been in this business long enough to remember those jokes.
Yeah.
So Jake Tapper is not some intrepid reporter bringing up a story nobody's talking about. He's trying to make money off, I assume he thought strategically and thought, okay, this book about Joe Biden is too old. How old is he? Is going to appeal to not only Republicans who hate Joe Biden, but also the Democrats who were angry at him for running again and staying in the race. Like, maybe it was that strategic of a position. And of course, his network is all in for him. It's about money. This is not about being some kind of courageous reporter. I mean, some of the people doing some of the best reporting are places like ProPublica, places like, some of the local places, the Texas Tribune, some of these other places that are really doing stories that aren't being heard everywhere. Let me ask you something. How likely do you think it is, out of all the millions of possible stories that are important enough to affect people on a national level? Because there are, and any day, there are at least thousands of those stories, right? So out of thousands of these stories that are candidates, how likely do you think it actually is that the mainstream media, I'm talking about Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, NPR, let me not leave them out, the cable news, how likely is it that all of them agree on which are the top 10 stories?
Highly unlikely.
Really unlikely. And yet that's what happens every single day. Somehow, out of all the thousands of possible stories they could cover as headline news, all of them agree. And I think we as journalists need to ask ourselves some pretty tough questions about why that is.
I think
We're not
it's
calling each other. We're not calling each other and saying, hey, what are you doing for headlines? Because I want to copy it. So A, how is it happening? And B, why?
my defense of media, including mainstream, corporate, whatever, is they have to make money to pay the journalists. And the way to do that is to get people to read their stuff. And to get people to read the stuff, you got to talk about the things people care about, and you've got to be the tastemakers of what those things necessarily should be. And so, how do we exist? How do we continue to fund any enterprise in journalism by covering what should be the most important stories, but might not be? I think the best example of that is, for me, is well, this is not exactly what I'm talking about, but like, I don't care at all about P. Diddy. And that story should not have been covered in your 1 hour of television at all, much less be resourced with a reporter on the scene baking in the heat all day for some kind of a tidbit so they can go live and say breaking news banner. That's bullshit. But what about all of the rest of the important work that they are doing at NPR or New York Times, Washington Post, CNN? A lot of those stories are really important and resourced, but they still have to get people to click on them. They still have to get people to subscribe and sell what is left of ad revenue. What do you, how do you find the nuance in paying journalists and keeping people interested? Did that make any sense? Are you going to
Yeah.
thump me right now?
So I am going to thump you. Yes.
Of course,
But
do
first,
it.
let me
Hit
just
me
say
hard.
that
Hit me as hard as you want.
I've been very open about the fact that I do not think journalism should be a for-profit enterprise,
Hmm.
ever, under any circumstances. It's the only industry explicitly protected in the Constitution, and that's for a reason. It is a public service, and it should not be about profit. Number one. But number two, the argument that you're using is essentially the same argument that the New York Times used to defend their reporting, their irresponsible reporting on Mamdani. They basically said, look, this generated a lot of engagement and it started a really engaging conversation. And so it was worth covering. Do you agree with that?
Do I agree with that it's worth
The New York
covering
Times
because
justification?
because it generates engagement? No, I think two things have to be true. It has to both generate engagement and be in the public's interest.
See, and there's the thing. But
Because
I think
otherwise,
there's
no one's
all kinds of
reading.
I think there's all kinds of engaging stories that people would
Sure.
be interested in that are not being covered while people are writing 18 million stories about P. Diddy. I actually don't have a problem with covering P. Diddy because you can do that in a responsible way. Maybe this is, you could talk to somebody who is an expert on prosecuting, you know, domestic abusers. You could have a really interesting conversation about sex trafficking. Like, you could use that as the linchpin for a really interesting conversation about issues that affect a lot of people. But that doesn't need to be the headline in every single major news organization in the country. Because when you do that, when everyone's duplicating one another, you know, and they're sending their very expensive and experienced journalist out to cover the same goddamn story every day, they are not covering a lot of other stories that
Right.
could be equally engaging and affect the same number of people and deserve top of the fold.
Well, I mean, this is such an important point, and I need to think more about it before I'll try to make one more point, which is what I heard when I heard you say that just now. My sarcasm, my cynicism kicked in and said, I'll give you an example of one of those thousand stories that you're talking about. Anything happening at FDA right now, and ProPublica and a lot of other places are doing good work on these things. Anything happening in HHS, anything happening in national parks, anything about this big bad bill, you could dig that apart and have all kinds of interesting stories. What I'm saying is, none of them, no matter how sexy you make it, is going to get the kind of clicks that P. Diddy is getting.
I don't think that's true. And I think that the clicks on the engagement on Instagram or TikTok or any of the other videos where very often less informed people are doing stories about, did you know this about, here's an unknown fact about the big beautiful bill, right? Or
You're calling that, you're breaking your own rule, by the way. You
I'm
just
just
alligator alleyed.
Oh,
You
I
just
did.
called it what
You're
they want
absolutely
you to call
correct.
it.
You're correct. I was trying to quote an influencer, but yes.
Fair enough. I get
But
it.
in any case, I did a post on LinkedIn because they just issued a major recall of like 300 and over 370,000 units of bacon, which I think had E. coli or something else. Somebody's going to fact check me. But and I said, look, here's the number of people who've been fired from the agency. This is going to be really dangerous. Here's a link to the place where you can subscribe to get updates on food recalls, because this is going to become even more important in the days ahead. That
Oscar
post
Mayer turkey bacon recalled for listeria contamination. Is that what you mean? No.
that maybe
Was that
if
it?
it was
No,
370.
a bacon. There's a few of them. A bacon
Yeah.
recall. 360,000 pounds of bacon being recalled due to potential, listeria.
Yeah.
I don't know
So
if it's
these
good.
are going to become more and more common because they have either riffed or fired or purposely
Yeah,
retired a lot of these employees, and the agency was already dangerously understaffed.
already, yeah.
So this is something that people care about, and you can cover this in a way that's engaging. If you can't cover something like that in a way that's engaging people, where they are like, uh-oh, I better read about this,
I mean,
then
you're
that's your
telling me, but
failing.
it is your failing. I agree with you, but you're telling me that the turkey bacon recall is as sexy as P. Diddy's sex trafficking, one of the most important, influential hip hop artists
Okay, now
in
you're
our
putting
time.
another standard on it, Pete.
Oops.
Before you were talking about the fact that it needed to drive engagement.
Yeah.
Now you're saying it also has to be sexy. It doesn't. It's not.
It
It should not be a for-profit enterprise. It doesn't need to be
right.
entertainment. It needs to be a public service, and it needs to drive engagement, meaning that it has to make the case that this matters to you, and here's why.
Sexy, or it has to be provocative, or it has to create fear, or else people aren't necessarily the vast majority of people, or it's not cutting through. I mean,
I
I've
reject
always
that.
go ahead, reject it with
I
details.
reject that as a standard of what makes good journalism or headline journalism. Has to be
Oh,
sexist, provocative, or drive fear?
no,
I reject that.
I rejected it's good journalism. What I'm saying is, in the reality of the way that we have access to things these days, it would seem that even the most like respectable journalists are making catchy thumbnails for their stories when they post them.
Have you ever gone back and read some of the original stories about Watergate? About, even if you go back to some of the original, like early 20th century, late 19th century, about the Crédit Mobilier scandal, for example, or some of the other scandals, they were neither sexy. They were, I mean, provocative to me, but I'm a nerd.
But that's a different. I feel like that's such a
No, I'm
different
talking
standard.
about, no, yeah, but you're adding this standard. This isn't a standard. This is the point of standards, is that they should stand the test of time, and having a standard where we need to be able to where real journalists need to be able to compete with E-News or ESPN. No, these are different things. We
But
need to
you're
drive engagement. We need to be of use to people. We need to you need to make the case that what you're reporting on is important, urgent, and matters to that person's life. And if that also drives engagement, then you're doing your job. It doesn't have to be sexy. It doesn't need to drive fear.
I fully agree with all of that. I'm trying to figure out how that is successful enough in today's media atmosphere to employ good people doing great journalism the way that there always have been, the way that you always have done, and many of your colleagues and many of your mentors.
How do ProPublica's doing great?
But they're not doing as great as I wish they could and would, especially with, I
Maybe,
think,
but they pay their journalists well, and
yeah,
they're
but I mean, it's
hiring.
But most people, but do you think that as many Americans have even know that ProPublica exists versus like some crank on YouTube where they're getting their information from, much less
Well,
Fox News or.
this is again a different standard, right?
Mhm.
You're adding yet another standard here. We're also not measuring the success of journalism based on whether it can compete with TikTok, or with propaganda spreaders or influencers. You know, ProPublica's reporting. I will tell you one thing: almost everybody in America knows about the investigations into Clarence Thomas's conflicts of interest, and you and I both know where that reporting came from. I mean, they were featured and named a bunch of times by John Oliver because the reporting was so good, right? Like, that to me is successful journalism. I don't mean to keep hammering on ProPublica. There's many other outlets that are doing. Teen Vogue has been killing it. Frankly, the Rolling Stone magazine has been doing great in their political coverage.
Hmm.
So, and driving clicks. The Onion. You know, if you talk to the current CEO of The Onion, he talks a lot about what they're doing and how analog it is and how inefficient their process is. And yet they're doing financially better than ever.
Oh,
And
wow.
and part of that is that they started issuing an actual physical tangible newspaper again. I get one in the mail every month. So
I had no, really? Wow, that sounds like a risky call to do going backwards, but if it's working, I love
it's
to hear
working.
it.
I get it
Wow.
delivered every month. I leave it out on my coffee
Well,
table and people love it.
so let me ask you this question just to move this part of the conversation a little bit further. Don't you think that was leading? Don't you think? Ugh, but I just did that to you. How do we meet people where they're at? Because I think that specifically, I'll ask about Gen Z. They don't know about ProPublica. They don't read newspapers. They certainly don't watch CNN or cable news. They overwhelmingly get their information from TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. I would say probably those specific platforms. How do we meet that group of people where they're at, or any other group of people where they're at?
So first, I want to say that research from the American Press Institute says that actually Gen Z and millennials, I mean millennials are middle aged now, but still, um, almost 100%. It's over 95%. Consult the news every day. And that's a wide variety of sources. They read actual newspapers, both local and national. They watch cable news, not in the numbers that boomers do, but nobody does. They go to websites, they go to apps, they listen to podcasts, they listen to radio, even.
I should have said
Um,
podcast. Yeah.
yeah. So I think they found out that on average, that age group gets their news from 6 different traditional store sources or social media every week.
Well,
And also,
you're citing data, and I was citing an anecdote. So who wins? I think I do.
probably in the propaganda war, you would. So also, we have found that younger people are the millennials and especially Gen Z have the highest numbers highest amount of willingness to pay for their news.
Hmm.
So they value good news. They're willing to pay for it and support it, and they're reading it. So, you know, it's interesting. I saw this, not to bring it back to TikTok, but I saw yet another upsetting video from this guy named Jarek Lewis that he posted just a few days ago. And he said, I think this idea that the average American is struggling and most people are living paycheck to paycheck, I think all of that is a lie. You can give me all the data you want, but I trust my national instincts. I trust my own eyes over something I can't, personally verify. And I thought, see, you're bringing up this danger of getting your news from social media, and that's the danger right there. That's what the danger is. Somebody saying, you can give me all the evidence in the world, but I'm going to continue to believe what it is that I believe,
That brings me
regardless.
to my other peekadillo. Peekadoo. The
Peccadillo,
first
yep.
one is just how to fight apathy and doing good journalism, responsible journalism in the public's interest is generally how I see things. But the other one is the lack of trust, the eroding trust in experts and institutions, which there's been a lot written about, of course. My whole premise for my show has always been find smart people, find smart people who are good at talking, have them on the show, mostly experts. And I have still the same faith, more faith in experts than I ever have. More faith in research than I ever have, because
Same.
I know people that do research for a living. So I just ask them about research and then I don't do it. And I know AI is making everybody even smarter, and everybody's an expert and an epidemiologist, as we learned, and so on. But that's my other concern, and the other thing I've thought about my whole career: fighting apathy. How do you get to people, and then how do you get to people with reliable information? Now that we've got this erosion in trust in experts and institutions, and in government, most importantly, I feel is the biggest concern. And whenever I talk to federal government workers, they say, I think what you already said, that they're underfunded, that they're under-resourced, that they're underpaid, and so on. And then people think they're, all just sitting around doing nothing. So what do
Like, you're
you, the
bringing up a
erosion?
really great point here. I'm so glad that you said this. I just recorded a video a few days ago about the so-called idea of elites. And,
Hmm,
it's a classic sign of authoritarianism and fascism to break down trust in experts. But let
yeah.
me let me just emphasize the exact point that you're making, which is the federal workers, the scientists, the professors, the teachers, they're working class. They're not making a bunch of money. The average salary for a chemist is like in the United States is like, I don't know, $50,000-$60,000 a year. Keeping in mind that the median salary for all Americans is like 53 maybe. These are not people making a ton of money. They're not in it because they're not elites. The people telling you to mistrust the experts, those are the elites. The elites are not some guy testing the water in the runoff of your local stream or river. That guy's making working class money, right? Like, he is as invested in the success of this economy as anybody else, and it's success in the economy for the average American. You have to ask yourself, what does this person get out of it? Right? This is the classic question of all journalists ask, and probably detectives, right? Like, who's got motive? Motive means an opportunity. But I ask myself this question all the time. Like, what do they get out of this? Either way, out of this legislation. And your average so-called elite, your college professor, who's probably still trying to pay off student loans on a salary of 75,000 or whatever, they are invested in the average American getting ahead because they're the average American. But again, I'm not trying to give people a pass except to say that we are all in fight or flight mode. Everybody is in a place of where panic could come at any moment.
Mm,
And so when we are manipulated, when we are inundated with misinformation, with propaganda, and we're already primed, evolutionarily primed, to look for someone to blame, to look for the threat,
hmm,
it is not surprising to me that we fall for these traps. Intellectual humility requires reflection. And we are living in a society in which the actual elites have created a system in which we don't have time for reflection. And that is by design. Even if it's not conscious design, it is at least unconscious design to leave us in a place where we don't have time to think.
uh, uh, so many follow-ups about that, but I know I want to ask you one last thing just to get your take on. It's always what I do when I'm talking to Celeste. It's like a menu of items that I just got to ask you about this, and then not follow up and not stay on that stream necessarily, but ask one more thing. And I gotta just, you've covered politics in Congress your whole life, and much of my life I covered it at the POTUS channel at SiriusXM. Watched the sausage be made, and certainly covered a lot of different pieces of legislation. And so I want to know how you see the giant piece of legislation
The
that was
2025
just
budget bill.
well, whatever they want to call what was just signed by the president. They call it the big beautiful bill. I call it
I
the
call it the
the worst
budget
bill
bill.
ever. You call it the budget bill. I wonder if you do that because a budget is a moral document and they're showing themselves. But what do you how do you see this compared to all the other pieces of legislation that have created opportunity or healthcare access to healthcare, or deregulated the financial institutions? Like, legislation comes back to haunt us, or to make our lives better in many cases and save our lives in many cases. So how do you see this that just
So
happened?
first, let me just say I'm going to end this on a note of hope.
Oh,
So stay tuned. I'm going to give everyone a little bit of optimism at the end here.
okay. All right.
But I will begin
Hmm.
by saying this is the worst piece of legislation of my lifetime.
Hmm.
And when I say worst, it sounds like I'm giving you my opinion, and I am. But journalists are allowed to be biased in favor of democracy. We're allowed to be biased in favor of fairness, and equitable access. And this takes us the other direction. You cannot be a journalist in this country without having seen the absolutely devastating effect that income and wealth inequality has had on our society at
Hmm.
every single level. And this takes us so far in the wrong direction. It's disastrous. Now, I will say that the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, for example, the Republicans built it in so that they're delayed until after the midterms. Now, that was strategic. They didn't want people to lose their health care and blame them before they got into the ballot box and voted for them. And then they'll feel the pain of losing their
Right.
health care and
Right.
have family members die to hunger or totally preventable diseases, right?
Right.
But I will also say that because of that, this is a budget bill. And that means you can make a new budget. So if you get a new majority in Congress,
Yeah.
if you get a new majority, you can create a new budget. As you said, budgets are moral documents. They tell us our priorities. When you make a
Yeah.
budget at home, it tells you what are your priorities? What are you going to spend on, right? And it's the same thing with Congress, that the most devastating cuts. Look, the bill is already going to have awful effects because there are cuts to Medicaid coming. There are hospitals that are going to shut down. There are things that are going to happen immediately that will not wait until after the midterms. But also, we can have a new set of priorities if we have a new Congress. And people really underestimate how effective phone calls to legislators are.
Well, I don't want to rain on your positive note, but you forced my hand.
I forced you to go negative.
You forced me to ask the elephant in the room question, which I have to ask every smart person I talk to, which is pretty much everybody I talk to here on the show, at least. How do you feel about the uh, possibility of a free and fair midterm election that could do what you just suggested around reversing these horrible cuts?
I don't know. We don't have free and fair elections at this point. They're not free or fair. I can't think of a time in the United States where we've actually had fully free and fair
Fair
elections.
enough. Appreciate that.
But,
But
after Obama's election, conservatives in this country did as they have done many, many times in the past, and they tried to restrict voting rights. And they've done that again and again and again,
yeah,
many
yeah.
times. And they have restricted them to the point where it probably had a big part to play in the re-election of Trump last year. So, but also a huge number of people who are eligible to vote didn't.
Right?
Like, so many. I don't remember the
Right.
percentage, but it was a lot.
Do you like compulsory voting like Australia has and other countries?
Yeah, I think you should be already opted in and registered to vote
Right.
and have to opt out.
Yep.
And I think that we should absolutely set aside a federal holiday so that voting is a holiday and everybody has the day off and you go and vote.
Yep.
I think we should make it as easy and normalized as possible to vote. It
Yep.
is your civic duty. And I know that's
Yep.
not sexy or provocative, but it is. And I would just say that if, after emancipation, the level, and after the 14th Amendment was passed, the voting participation among black men in this country was above 95%. Because that's a people who understood the power of the vote. Right? If we could just get people to understand that the way to fight back against all this corruption and this attempt to limit our freedoms is to exercise them to the most aggressive and enthusiastic way possible, we would not be in the position that we're in.
A lot of great insight on that and everything. Thank you very much for putting up with my technical issues on the sound. Thank you very much for joining me today. I think everybody should go follow you on Instagram because you're doing great work over there. Those videos that you've been making now, I should be watching and asking you about them all the time. So really helpful and important. It's journalism. And we always appreciate you for joining us. One of the greatest, Celeste. Thank you very, very much for doing this with me today. I appreciate it.
Always a joy to talk to you, Pete. Have a good one.
And I'm going to end the stream and figure out what the hell happened.
Yeah, because you're